thank you very much for the opportunity to share what has been an interesting, very interesting journey, well, of OGP. It all started for me like in December 2010, January 2011. Suddenly I got an email out of the blue that I was invited to the White House with a group to share some insights in open government, transparency, and accountability. It was an enormous privilege for a Mexican member of the civil society community suddenly to receive such an email. I did check the website and confirm that it was not a joke or fake, and it was a true invitation to the White House. So a few weeks later, I was there sitting in a room with 9 people from 9 civil society organizations around the world, people from South Africa, people from Tanzania, people from India, and 9 representatives from the government. And the basic conversation we were having is, well, there's an interest to promote accountability, an interest to promote transparency, integrity of public officials, and use technology platforms as a leverage to push these values around the world. But the first thing that surprised me, it was a very open conversation with not fixed terms. And the first opportunity I had to talk when I was seated at the table, I asked a very basic question. What is the image of victory for OGP? To portray something like the light at the end of the tunnel. I find it very tasteless and crass to use war metaphors, but I think this helped me to try to structure the conversation, why I was invited there, why all these people were talking on how to promote accountability and transparency around the world. And I was very surprised that all the people in the table didn't have a common view of what OGP would look like and what was the goal and the aim of having us all seated in the table talking about it. This was January 2011. Somehow, like 18 months later, there's more or less a clear view, or not a very clear view of what OGP is. Actually, it is political will at high speed. In less than a year, 55 countries are committed to improve their transparency and accountability status at the highest ranking level. The chief of states, the presidents of these 55 countries that say, we have an interest to change transparency and accountability in our respective nations. Each country finds its own track and speed to achieve the goals. Please walk in my shoes for a while. Mexico, it's a young democracy. There's a huge debate if we have been a democracy for 10 years, for 12 years, for 20 years. But nobody will dare to say that we have been a democracy for more than a quarter of a century. So some things that are quite new for us could be very old and kind of old-fashioned. Actually, my claim to fame in Mexico is that I found out that the budget of the state of Baja California Sur, have anyone heard of Los Cabos, this famous resort in California? Well, this resort is in the state of Baja California Sur. And I found out that the total budget of Baja California Sur, the document itself approved by the Congress, was just 6 lines and something like 300-400 words. The whole budget explaining how the money of the people of Baja California Sur will be distributed. So if you take the aim of OGP in a political circumstance like Baja California Sur, just to have a more normal budget, the whole budget was basically said that the state of Baja California Sur will spend 7 billion pesos during the next year. And there was no clear explanation of how these 7 billion pesos will be distributed for education, for health, to pay for Congress, to pay for the executive branch. So if you take the track of Baja California Sur in OGP, in Transparency and Accountability Challenge, it will be a very, very different track that if you take the aims and the goals and the things we are discussing today here in New York City. So I think I found it quite reasonable that each country will find its own speed. The only requirement is that all countries head in the same direction to change the status quo from where they were to where they want to be at their own speed. So 55 countries through OGP are using the platform of OGP to change and promote transparency and accountability through a structured dialogue between civil society and government. Well, in most countries, this is a picture of a structured dialogue between authority and civil society. And I'm so unfair because the structured dialogue between civil society and government in the steering committee, I cannot speak for the 55 countries that join OGP, looks more like this. I don't know of any global initiative where civil society has so much stake at the table. We are not treated as witness, we are not treated as uncomfortable guests, we are treated as equal partners to government. For example, in Mexico, a couple of years ago, there was a huge global conference on climate change. And the governments were in one hotel, and the civil society people were in another hotel like 10 kilometers away. And yeah, well, you get some press release, and you get an invitation for a dinner or a lunch or whatever. But there was no direct dialogue. And that's what I think it's the most important and relevant transformation of the OGP initiative. In these 55 countries, if the civil society doesn't have a stake in the conversation, is not seated at the table in equal terms as the government, it does not represent the essence and the spirit of OGP. And I think that's the most transformative ingredient of the initiative. What is OGP? I think it's a social network for reformers. And the best anecdote to communicate that came from a friend from civil society in Mexico, which is working with the Mexican equivalent of the FBI. Imagining the Mexican equivalent of the institution that was found by Edgar Hoover, well, it's not like the beacon of transparency and accountability. It's not in their top priorities, in the top of mind. So this friend was trying to get in contact with this person that had some information, this public servant that he didn't want to share. So a group of civil society organizations pressed the presidential office, and we were received a couple of weeks ago by the chief of staff of the Mexican president. It was a relevant momentum for Mexican civil society suddenly being at the table with the chief of staff of the president. And he heard about these problems with the Mexican version of the FBI through 10 organizations of civil society. And the next day, this guy at the FBI that had not taken the calls, had not responded to the emails, called my friend from civil society and said, oh, I really need to see you. We really need to talk about the information you have requested for the last 6 months. I have it here in my desk, and I have the urge to give it to you. Said, sorry, I cannot make it today. Oh, don't worry, I go to your office and bring it back to you. This wouldn't have happened. This have never happened if there was no civil society pressuring from one side the president office, as it was a compromise in OGP, take it more seriously, and call this civil servant that suddenly he had an earthquake because civil society was pressing, the president office was pressing, and it was basically a network of pressure. The president would have not cared that much about transparency in the FBI if it was in OGP. People in civil society felt empowered to call the president office because they knew it was under priorities OGP, and suddenly this friend of mine, which was requesting information from 6 months, got information directly in her desk from the public servant she was trying to reach for half a year. What is OGP? Well, it's a learning opportunity because we are seeing what different countries are doing. For example, Brazil is going to host the Olympics and the World Cup. And each of the infrastructure projects, bridges, highways, stadiums, have their own web page, and they are saying how much money they are spending, which was the allocated budget, how long it took. I just learned that the Empire State Building, it's a reference in the world of architecture for one specific thing. It cost less money than originally was planned. This is really hard to find in architecture. So it's nice to have a web page, if it's public money, used to build a highway or a stadium, and know how much money is going to be paid. Well, that's an experience that Brazil has shown. And if Brazil has done it, another of the 55 countries are learning, watching, and seeing how could they do better in transparency and accountability. In this sense, OGP, it's like a global competition for best practices. What it's not OGP, it's not an index, it's not a ranking. We have a clash of attention of values. We want to be inclusive to bring more countries in, and at the same time raise their standards. But if you want to be inclusive, you cannot have the same standards for New York City and for Los Cabos and Baja California Sur in transparency and accountability. But you have to have some standards in order to make the initiative not a tragic joke. Of course, there are risks ahead. If you have 55 countries, you have 55 different risks. There's the risk of hot air, the risk of a prime minister or of a president of trying to use the initiative just as a PR opportunity or just the low-hanging fruit. The initiatives that they already had in the agenda, put them forward and say, well, we're doing so much for transparency and accountability. Of course, there are risks in the road. The thing is, if civil society keeps on demanding, keeps on criticizing, this risk will have more visibility, and the countries that want to use OGP just as a PR or a photo opportunity will get more visibility, and I think we'll get more traction to promote change, transparency, and accountability in Los Cabos, in New York, and in so many places. And a good anecdote I have of what OGP could achieve, I had a conversation in an elevator with a man from Estonia after a presentation like this, where I said that OGP was like a cake that was not even in the oven. The mix for the cake was not even ready. And in the elevator, he came and said to me, well, sadly, I don't remember the name of the guy. He just went out, and I think it's very clever what he told me. I've been for 3 years trying to get a meeting with the Prime Minister of Estonia, and I haven't. When he knew I was coming to OGP, the same that happened to my friend, they called me from their office and offered me a coffee. And I had a coffee with the Prime Minister of Estonia. And thanks to that, the movement in Estonia of transparency and accountability is moving in the right direction. Another experience in Mexico. In Mexico, you could know, for example, how much money the president spends on towels, how much money he spends on wine or food for his family in the presidential house. But you cannot get hold of an individual budget of a public school. That's a secret of state in Mexico's. So what we did in my organization, for 3 years, we requested by all means, through newspapers, through media, through FOIA, the budget of a single school, and it was impossible to get. We put this request on the action plan of the Mexican, New Mexico OGP action plan. And a couple of weeks ago, we had the budget of 2,000 elementary schools in Mexico City. And a young colleague in my office went and said, well, it's just 2% of the whole thing. I said, well, that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is I've been working for 3 years to get a single budget for a single school, and I have not achieved it. And thanks to OGP, it happened. So what's basically I think it's a huge opportunity to change, to raise the standards of transparency and accountability in a global level, use technology to communicate, to promote these values. It's 55 governments willing to learn from their peers in civil society, and civil society willing to understand the complexities faced by government reforms. Any way you look at it, I think it's a huge opportunity for Los Cabos, for New York, for Mexico, and for several places around the world. Thank you very much.